The first knock on my door that morning sounded like a punctuation mark sharp. Unwelcome. And exactly the kind of small thing that turns into a small war. And then into something bigger. And then into the kind of story you tell people at parties because you still can't quite believe it happened. I opened the door in my robe, coffee in hand. And there stood Marjorie Clay from the Homeowners Association. Clipboard like armor. Eyes like weather bright. Hard. Ready to stir a storm. She smiled the way some people smile before they read you a bill. My name is Jonah Reed. And I have a little house on the corner of a sleepy stretch called Willow Bend. I grew up on my father's land, not a big ranch. Just enough fence posts and stories to teach you that property is where pride and memory live, and when I moved into Willow Bend I thought I had traded a few acres for neighbors who waved and borrowed sugar. I was wrong about some of that. But not about the sugar. People here still borrow sugar. They just write rules about how and when you can borrow it. Marjorie arrived with a box of donuts. Like she was trying to buy daylight. Good morning, Jonah, she chirped, handing over the donuts as if an offering could smooth the way. As if powdered sugar could lubricate bylaws. She told me quickly that some residents had complained about my shed. About the height of my fence. About the way my truck was parked too close to the curb. Her voice was light. But every complaint was a notch on the same belt, control. She called it community standards and consistency. And she used those words the way some people use a hammer. Then she asked if I was harboring law enforcement. I laughed because that's what you do when the world suddenly tilts toward ridiculousness. You laugh, so you don't cry. She didn't laugh. She'd already dialed before she left my driveway. And by the time I realized what she'd done, there were sirens on the horizon. A police car at the corner. And a dozen neighbors peering from behind curtains like it was theater night. What she claimed and what she told them was that a man was on my property who had no right to be there. That he was wearing a badge even though he was not on duty. That he was intimidating residents. It sounds, in a sentence, like a misinterpretation. In a neighborhood, stories spread like lemon trees and some are quick, cheerful, and thorny. But the devil lies in intention. And Marjorie's intention was to make me look small. To make me answer for the audacity of living the way I wanted to live on my own corner. Eli showed up in the middle of all this. Eli Thorne. My friend since high school. Who used to be an investigator for the state and who, off the clock, was as calming as a good cup of espresso. He had been helping me hang a shelf because my hands shake when I reach too high now. And the shelf had kept us laughing that morning. Handing tools back and forth. He stood there. Hands greasy. And when someone asked him to show ID, he shrugged. Pulled out his old badge, the kind you keep because it tells you who you were, and said, I'm off duty. Folks. People looked at him like he'd brought a storm as a guest. Marjorie made her calls and wrote her notes. And in the space between her handwriting and the truth, she invented a threat. You can see how easy that is, a clipboard. An audience. An appetite for order. She wanted the narrative to be that the neighborhood needed protection from me. And sometimes people who want to lead will manufacture the need for followers. I wish I could say I was surprised. But by then I had lived on this block long enough to see that community organizing is a good thing when it's done to help people. And a different animal entirely when it becomes a means to be in charge of other people's lives. The first wave of fallout was bureaucratic and petty. An envelope with a yellow sticker that read, Official Notice. The HOA loves those words slid under my door later that week. It accused me of harboring unauthorized personnel and creating undue alarm on common property. The language was dry. Measured. But its purpose was to make me step back. To make me apologize without being asked. To make me consent. It was also, I would learn, the opening move in a chess game that Marjorie had been playing for months. From the outside, what I owned was a modest corner lot with a shed my father had built and a porch where my wife no. My wife had passed years earlier. And her memory sat on that porch like an old friend used to sit with me on Sundays. From within, it was a place guarded by memory and stubbornness and a tendency to say, this is mine. Leave it alone. Which doesn't play well in a place with a rule for every thought. Marjorie saw my independence as a problem that could be solved by paperwork. I saw her as a person who had forgotten that community is alive because of the people in it. Not the rules. Eli was not the only one who noticed something off. Neighbors started taking sides in ways that made lunch at the corner deli feel like a trial. Linda, our HOA vice president, tried to be fair. She really did. But even Linda had a ledger of favors Marjorie had done for her. Favors can be currency in small towns. And once you start to accept favors, obligations stack up. By the time we hit the emergency meeting Marjorie called, two camps had formed. The camp that wanted to preserve the polite structure that made their roses aligned, and the camp that thought rules were fine until they were used as weapons. At the meeting, Marjorie arrived with handouts, a projector, and a demeanor that said she had rehearsed the role of victim until it fit. She spoke in a voice that had been trained to sound reasonable. She sounded reasonable when she recited the phrase, community safety. She played the audience like a careful violinist, plucking at their anxieties until they hummed the tune she wanted. We must maintain standards, she said. We must ensure the safety of all residents. That was when Eli, who had been quiet all evening, set his phone on the projector. And the room changed. You can tell a story 100 ways until someone shows the tape. Eli pulled up the doorbell camera from my porch. Footage that recorded the whole morning. Marjorie on my driveway. Donut box in hand. Clipboard in the sun. My laugh. Eli's shrug as he pulled his jacket on. He scrolled. And then he played the clip of Marjorie dialing the phone from the edge of my lawn. It showed her voice. But more importantly, it showed her leaving my property and then standing on the sidewalk while she spoke into the phone, far from any threatening situation. Far from any danger. Then Eli pulled up the 911 transcript. And the words were colder than the sound. Marjorie had described a man acting as an officer. She had used language that suggested menace. But the video showed no menace. It showed a neighbor who liked donuts and hated my fence. People in the room shifted. Laughter turned tentative. Teasing turned nervous. When you take power by orchestrating fear, proof can be slippery. Some of Marjorie's supporters squinted at the screen and tried to find holes, maybe the camera angle. Maybe the timestamp. Maybe a conspiracy. Linda. Poor Linda. Had that look in her eyes where you can tell someone is trying to hold on to an argument, because letting go would mean admitting she had been wrong. And admitting you're wrong in public is like admitting a seam in your pants. It's uncomfortable. And people rarely do it when there's a crowd. But evidence is stubborn. Eli had more. Emails where Marjorie had asked for witnesses. Notes about keeping standards. A draft flyer she had prepared fingered with phrases like, protect our families and stand united. When you stitch together the draft, the phone call, the projector, and the flyers, you see the shape of an intention. It wasn't accidental. It was a campaign. When Linda finally stood and, with a voice that trembled only once, said, we have bylaws to prevent misuse of authority, the room exhaled as one. The motion to censure Marjorie passed. It felt like a small miracle and a small victory, and the kind of quiet justice you get when evidence meets good sense. Marjorie left in a storm of indignation, her hands a tremor of fury, muttering about lawsuits and character assassination, as if the community had done something outrageous by showing what had been on tape. But the real battle didn't end in that meeting. There are always people who do not hear reason. There are always more letters and the paperwork that follows like a second wave after the tide. Marjorie, stung and furious, filed a motion to call an emergency vote on my suspension from HOA privileges, alleging harassment and endangering community tranquility. It read like a legal poem, precise, perfunctory, and meant to burn time and patience. You learn, in fights like this, that the judicial-sounding words are tools to be wielded. They don't need to be true to hurt you. They only need to exist. The night before the vote, my phone blew up with messages. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years sent warnings. Some supportive, some cautiously neutral. A few anonymous flyers appeared on porch steps warning of disharmony if outsiders continue to set the tone. The word outsider stung because I had lived here longer than some of those who called me one. But that's how narratives work. You can be inside and still feel outside if someone decides to draw a line. I sat on my porch late that night with a mug of coffee gone cold and thought about my father's hands and how he used to teach me to measure twice and cut once. He'd also told me to pick my battles, a phrase I used to think meant avoid trouble. But that night it meant, more precisely, choose where you let your dignity be tested. I thought about what I wanted. I didn't want to be at the center of some petty power play. I wanted my shed for my tools, my porch for my memories, my voice when the neighborhood needed one. But I also realized that when someone weaponizes community standards, Not answering becomes permission. The challenge becomes louder than the complaint. The next afternoon, at the scheduled vote, the gym in the community center smelled like old varnish and heated bodies. People tend to be their truest selves when they gather. You get generosity and pettiness in equal measure, sometimes in the same person. Marjorie arrived with a lawyer this time, not a big one, but a man who used phrases like preservation of order and binding documents. And he wore a suit the way some people wear armor. He spoke in hypotheticals and moved the conversation like a chess piece. But the projector rolled again, and Eli's phone was ready. He had obtained legally. He assured copies of the 911 transcript and the security footage. He had sworn statements from a couple of neighbors who had seen Marjorie pacing the sidewalk and heard her making calls in a tone that wasn't alarmed but was precise in its intent. He also had a written history of hours Marjorie had spent on community outreach that coincided with other complaints against me and a few other residents who had chosen to keep their lawns slightly wild, to park trucks they used for work in their driveways, to live loud and messy and real. The meeting turned. People leaned forward. I felt both ridiculous and grateful, like I was at once under a microscope and behind a shield. The vote to suspend me was defeated by a margin that made me dizzy with relief. Then the board took a separate vote to form an independent review of Marjorie's conduct. The irony, of course, is that sometimes justice in small towns moves with the speed of a river and sometimes like a glacier. But that day things moved with the odd velocity of a river with a little shove. After the meeting, a few neighbors crossed the hall and shook my hand. Others avoided my gaze. Some came with casseroles. One woman brought a pie with the crust wound into tiny stars, and I accepted both pie and apologies with a half smile that still felt awkward. Marjorie, who accepted neither pie nor apology, walked out like a character in a tragedy who had missed the cue to be humble. She spoke of lawsuits then, and the sound of the word floated like a threat. Easy to wave when you want to frighten someone into silence. In the days that followed, legal notices shuffled like paper birds across my mailbox. Marjorie's lawyer wrote a letter of intent. I responded with a calm and careful letter signed by my own counsel. We were both learning the language of law the way people learn new music with wrong notes, and then better ones. It was expensive and stupid and necessary. Which is to say, it was modern life. I won't pretend the experience didn't change me. There were nights I lay awake queasy with the sense that any small mistake could become someone's headline. I had to learn to separate noise from threat, to take counsel seriously and not let the ambulance-chasing paranoia set my ribs on ice. I also learned something more subtle, that community is defended not by rules alone, but by the willingness of people to look at the person beside them and reconsider the story they've been told. Rules are written by us. They can be wielded for safety or used like blades. A month later, the independent review concluded that Marjorie had overstepped. She had a reputation for meticulousness. She also had a blind spot for empathy. The review recommended training on conflict resolution and a formal reprimand for misuse of HOA authority. It suggested that the board adopt a clearer protocol for complaints and a requirement for mediation before a report escalates to law enforcement. It felt like a small thing training. Protocols, but those are the kinds of small things that can prevent big damage. Marjorie did not take the training. She resigned instead. And even the resignation had the dramatic flourish of someone who preferred spectacle to settlement. She left a note that read like a manifesto. She had tried to protect our way of life and had been maligned. People argued about it for weeks. The way people argue about whether a painting is a masterpiece or just a painting. But in the end, the board accepted her resignation, appointed an interim president who had a gentler voice, and rewrote the complaint process to emphasize mediation. For me, the resolution was double-edged. On one hand, I had my shed and my porch and the right to park my truck without being policed like a spectacle. On the other hand, something had been revealed about our neighborhood that I couldn't unsee, a hunger for power among some, a weariness among others, and the way ordinary grievances can mutate if you let paperwork stand in for conversation. I began, quietly, to organize coffee mornings on my porch where people could come and speak without the threat of transcripts and projectors. It was small and ineffective in the way of all beginnings. But people came, some to apologize, some to complain about their own human troubles, some to lend a tool. There was a moment I like to replay, not because I'm nostalgic, but because it taught me about grace. One afternoon, Mrs. Renshaw, a woman who had voted for Marjorie and who had a yard that could win awards every year, walked up my steps with a dish towel and a bag of lemons. She hesitated, then said, "I don't think she meant harm, Jonah. I think she meant to keep things neat." I told her I believed that too, and I admitted that I had seen how neatness comforts people. She blinked. Then she laughed a small, honest sound and said, "Well, your fence can be tidy and my rose beds can be tidy. And we can still be neighbors. Right?" We both laughed, and then we sat and drank coffee until the afternoon softened into dusk. And the moment felt like the thinnest, strongest bridge between us. If I have a regret, it's not that things escalated. That was part of life here. My regret is that we let fear do so much of our talking for so long. We have a talent in small communities for turning difference into drama, for making private choices into public morality plays. It's easier to nod along with someone who promises order than to actually talk about why someone's truck sits where it sits or why someone's garden grows like it does. The choices every neighbor makes come from someplace: pride, grief, habit, pride again, and when we start reducing people to bullet points, we lose the stories behind them. There were a few scenes I haven't told, that day-by-day scaffolding of small cruelties and small kindnesses that make up living among others. There was the woman who let her dog bark at midnight because she missed her husband and it made her feel less alone. There was the teenage boy who painted his pickup with the stars of his favorite team because it made his father smile. There was the man who kept his porch light on because he was trying to keep ghosts at bay. None of those things justify weaponizing codes or filing false complaints. But they remind you that rules without empathy are brittle. I tell this story now because people ask me, were you a victim? Were you a hero? Were you right? Those are tidy questions. Neat boxes that make for good comment sections. The truth is messier and more interesting. I was stubborn. Yes. I was stubborn enough to keep my shed and my memories and to insist on being allowed to live in a way that felt honest to me. I was also willing to hold up the camera and let truth be the judge. And I had a friend who would stand quietly and then speak loudly when it mattered. The neighborhood was both my jury and my chorus. And it did what neighborhoods sometimes do: it judged. It forgave. It reformed. And it moved on. There is something cinematic about the whole sequence. I suppose the doorbell camera, the 911 transcript, the projection in a fluorescent-lit gym, but there is also something very ordinary: a man who wanted to keep his porch, a woman who wanted order, and a system that was only as good as the people who used it. If this sounds like a moral, it's because perhaps it is. Systems require stewardship, not worship. Regulations are tools, not gods. As for Marjorie, I don't keep track of her. People who take fights personally often find other fights to pick. She moved away eventually, a few months after she resigned. And rumor has it she landed in a town where the roses were already pruned to her liking. I wish her well. She was, after all, someone's friend, someone's neighbor, someone's sister. I hope she found a place that made her feel less like a general and more like a person. What changed for me was quieter. I started a column in the community newsletter called Porch Notes, where people could write short things about neighbors, lost dogs, recipes, small memories. It isn't glamorous. It's a list of things that remind us we're not just a collection of complaints. It helped. It made the HOA newsletter, that sometimes solemn roll of rules, into a place where someone's lemon pie could sit beside a reminder about trash day. Little bridges. So where are we now? Willowbend is still a place that argues about hedges and paint colors and car lengths. We still have rules, we always will, but the way we handle complaints changed. We added a mediation step. And more people sign up for the community coffee on Saturday mornings than I can count. People come with their hands full of gossip and leave with a casserole or, at least, an explanation. And sometimes, that is enough. If you watch this and think I'm taking sides, maybe you're right. I am. I will pick the messy, stubborn person with a porch and a memory over anyone who thinks power is a prize to be hoarded. But I also pick grace over revenge. And I choose to believe that when a community looks at itself, honestly, it can find a better way to be together. Now here's the part where I want to hear from you. Did Marjorie do the right thing by enforcing rules even if it hurt a few feelings? Or did she cross a line when she weaponized her position? Is it better to have strict standards that keep a place tidy, or looser rules that let people be messy and human? Tell me your story. Have you ever been on the receiving end of a community complaint? Or have you been the one to raise your hand and say, this borders on wrong? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who lives near an HOA. And if you believe, like I do, that conversation beats a clipboard any day, hit like and subscribe for more stories about neighbors, land, and the tiny fights that make us who we are.